So I'm not going to lie to you. I've been sitting on this review pretty much all of last year and throughout this year. If I had to distill the why down to a simple answer, it's that the C70 is great. It's just a great camera. You want one, get one. It's worth the money and you won't be disappointed. Even in 5 years, I don't see this being a camera left by the wayside. I mean, I certainly want one, even as a C500 Mark II owner. I also know that plenty of people have traded their Komodos in for C70s, if that means anything. Plus, the C70 is actually available and currently holds LensRental.com's most rented new camera and apparently wins by a mile in that regard. Chris Ray and I were chatting about it at the recent Film Tools CineShred event, and he was saying it's become his workhorse. He talked about it recently with Film Tools in regards to shooting his new documentary. In any case, we both agree that the C70 is a top-tier camera worthy of any filmmaker's toolkit. But that's not in a review, that's an opinion. Where I was really waffling with was in the lens of this review. You know, what was it? How was I going to take it? Was I going to go from the perspective of production or indie creators? You know, everyone loves to hear about how a camera can give them a big budget look for the least amount of money. But at this point, almost every cinema-focused camera that comes out these days can do that. So now you're on to ergonomics and features, right? Clearly, the C70 can be used by solo shooters, and that seems to be who it's aimed at. But could it work on the aforementioned big budget set? It is Netflix approved, for whatever that's worth. You know, the line has just gotten so fuzzy. On the one hand, you've got image and codec concerns when looking at a camera, and on the other hand, you've got workflow and hardware concerns. Since the image of any modern camera is pretty much up to snuff for nearly any project, I guess what truly makes a cinema camera is the workflow stuff nowadays, as long as the codec is good enough. Technically, all cinema cameras are video cameras, but not all video cameras are cinema cameras. There's got to be a line somewhere, so let's see if we can define it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying cinema camera good, video camera bad. I'm saying we shouldn't get caught up in marketing hype in general, and we should strive to be objective and think about our project's needs when it comes to making purchasing or rental decisions. I also don't think making an aspirational purchase is a good idea, like buying an Alexa or a Red just to help jumpstart your career as a cinematographer. But as camera tech is kind of meeting in the middle, I don't think that's as much of an issue now as it would have been, say, 10 or even 5 years ago. Now you can really focus on doing more projects and less on being a product, so to speak. Get back to networking, you know what I mean? In any case, I think it's the easiest way to define a cinema camera right now is to simply look at the cameras being deployed on film sets and just go with the most used features. I certainly don't think the ability to replace the lens on a video camera instantly makes it a cinema camera, and a DSLR is a photo camera first, right? Not a video camera. That's fair. So, looking at the feature sets of the Red Raptor or Ranger, the Arri Alexa, Mini LF65, and the Sony Venice, I'll say that an ideal baseline cinema camera intended for film and television work has the following. A Super 35 or full-frame 6K or greater sensor, 4K obviously is acceptable, 2 SDI ports minimum, audio of some kind, like a 2 3-pin XLRs or 1 5-pin XLR, like on the Venice, something like that. 2 accessory power ports, 12 and or 24 volt, time code and Genlock via LEMO or BNC, RAW and 10-bit or greater log modes, ProRes is the clear favorite for compressed, XLR or LEMO power, and a built-in V-lock or a gold mount would be really nice, PL mount, native or, swappable, 14 plus stops of dynamic range, obviously robust build quality, reliable recording media, full image control, obviously the ability to, adjust all your parameters. Internal NDs are optional, but really common these days. Same with fizz. That also seems to be pretty common, but I'll say optional. Now, that seems like a reasonable checklist definition by my eye. Granted, any camera can be a cinema camera if it's used to make a movie, and certainly not every production will need every single feature or will have a decent workaround ready. But again, I'm just trying to come up with a definition for the sake of making comparisons on hardware and its viability on a traditional set, not drawing conclusions on the viability of a camera to help create an amazing story. For instance, my C500 Mark II ticks nearly all these boxes except for accessory power, although I have DTAP coming off the full-frame Camera Co. V-lock plate, and fizz. So I'd be comfortable saying it's still a cinema camera, as both of those things can be easily worked around without much compromise. And I know someone is going to clutch their pearls at the 6K, 4K thing. Obviously, 2K is totally fine, at the Alexa Mini. I'm just drawing conclusions from today's top-of-the-line, most used cameras on film and TV sets to make a workable definition. Plus, most people shoot 4K on the Alexa Mini now, even though it's not native. To kind of put all this together, I'll share a quote I agree with from Steven Soderbergh. He said, cinema is not about the format and it's not about the venue. Cinema is an approach. Cinema is a state of mind on the part of the filmmaker. I've seen commercials that have cinema in them, and I've seen Oscar-winning movies that don't. I'm fine with this. And unquote. Richard Linkletter said something that also fits here. He said, you can now just point and capture things, and that's a great thing, obviously, for the world and communication, but it doesn't necessarily equal art. There's a skill involved, and one of the first things that people find out in filmmaking is that the skill isn't being able to push a red button on a camera. The real skill is in storytelling, unquote. So while our definition has the word cinema in it, we're not talking about the art, we're talking about the hardware. I just really want to hammer that home before the angry comments. Also, it should be noted that I'm really only using the C70 as one example here because my intent is to also use this article video to set up a framework for my camera reviews going forward, as there's a bunch of cameras that don't fit the bill of a cinema camera. Something like an R5C, Pocket 6K, or an FX3 are far further removed from the realm of cinema camera, for instance, but still make amazing images. And I feel like it's worth the effort to make these distinctions so you, the consumer, can be better informed more easily. Now, all that being said, Greg Fraser, ASC, just shot a little short for Apple with Catherine Bigelow with the iPhone 13, and I was very impressed by it. So was he. And recently on a podcast said he's about to shoot a project on an FX3. So to reiterate, any camera can be a cinema camera if you shoot a movie on it, but not every camera is a cinema camera. You get what I mean? I can guarantee Greg isn't shooting Dune Part 2 on an iPhone, all right, or an FX3. Anyway, so where does the C70 sit objectively? Is it a cinema camera, as we've been calling it? Seeing as monitoring is a pretty big issue for film sets and locking ports even more so, the lack of SDI or proper power solutions is pretty glaring. It also saves to SD cards, which could scare some productions. But as of now, there is RAW, which is really awesome. What a value add for the C70. Plus, you have time code, plenty of dynamic range, sturdy build quality. It's plastic-ish, but it feels good, except for the little monitor. Internal NDs, and you can easily adapt PL lenses to it. People have gone PL to EF all the time. So after careful consideration, I'm confidently saying that this Canon C70 is a cinema quality B cam. Or by another definition, a perfect video camera for a solo operator or indie production. The image, codecs, and bitrate are all up to snuff for traditional television and film use, but the body just barely isn't. Does it need to be? No, of course not. Like I said before, any camera is technically a cinema camera if you make a movie with it, but based on our hardware definition, it just barely misses the mark. Something like the XF series of cameras might have SDI, but the image certainly isn't as beautiful as the C70, and you're stuck with that one lens. I think we both know which one we'd go for given the choice. Going forward, I'll likely come up with more specific or elucidative ways to categorize these cameras, but this article is already long enough as it is. With all that out of the way, and to start the actual review part of this review, I've got to say I'm a big fan of this camera, and it falls right into the same spot that my C100 Mark II fit when I was doing a lot of work on my own. Although it's packing way more punch than the C100 Mark II ever did, I think this thing is absolutely killer for any solo operators, indie outfits, certainly music videos, definitely documentaries, events, and obviously, as I said, a B cam for any existing Canon or even RE set, as Canons are often used. You know, I've spoken at length about my love of the C100 Mark II, and the C70 is everything that camera was and way, way more. First off, the image is fantastic. You can read my review of the C300 Mark III as it compares to the C500 Mark II. I actually made a video about it on this channel as well. And as the C70 has the C300 Mark III DGO sensor in it, the image is functionally identical, and you've still got your 4K 10-bit 422 XF AVC codec in an MXF wrapper and now RAW. Which is amazing. The compressed files are incredibly gradable, no macro blocking or anything to speak of, smooth gradations between colors and exposure levels, plenty of latitude, and all with a very, very low noise floor. You never know just by pushing the footage around in post that the image came from such an affordable prosumer camera. Even cranking the saturation or putting curves to absurd limits, you really only see some noise-like artifacts at worst. Obviously, it's going to break at some point, but by my eye, it's hard to get much better data collection, especially at this price point. Now, the body is small with all the reassignable buttons right at your fingertips, which I love. It's got built-in NDs, which for me is a requirement in a modern video camera, as well as a built-in mini XLR jacks, which are easy enough to get an adapter or a cable with full-size XLR on the other end. The lens mount is RF, which means your lens options are pretty vast, with EF and PL being the obvious standard choices. The RF lenses themselves seem pretty nice, with something like the compact L series 24-105 f4 being a solid all-arounder choice for run and gun like event work. I wasn't given time with it, but I've seen the similarly tiny L series 24-70 2.8 get great reviews, and I personally was a fan of the 35 1.8 macro, which focused silently and had optical image stabilization like the 24-105, but with the added benefit of the wide aperture and macro focusing capabilities. It wasn't an L series lens though, and I did notice a touch of green chromatic aberration, but nothing horrible. The L series 50 1.2 by comparison is an enormous lens by comparison, and it's not huge, but it's kind of big, and seemed to focus rather loudly, although it did say it needed a firmware update when I put it on the body, which I didn't know how to do because I was just borrowing the setup for like a couple days. But all in, the RF lenses likely will see some refining, but as it stands, the optics are fantastic by my eye, and the mount itself is clearly the future for Canon, as well as other camera manufacturers setting the standard as they did with EF, especially because Canon has stopped making EF lenses. Other companies haven't, but Canon is like, we're done. We make no more of those. We're only doing RF now, so buckle up, buckos. Anyway, autofocus on this camera can be great given your subject is properly lit. I noticed it would immediately start hunting if I tried to focus on my black cat in some situations, even during the day. My C500 Mark II doesn't have this problem, or doesn't seem to. And while different lenses definitely have an effect on autofocus performance, I was somewhat disappointed in that regard. As with the C500 and C300, the face tracking is blazingly quick. And in the C70 also seems to include head tracking. So when your subject turns around, it keeps the autofocus lock. I also noticed you could have 5 or more faces in the frame, and it would recognize all of them and give you the option to toggle between them with the little joystick, or, to tap it. The C70 also has sort of an object tracking mode where you can assign a point to something in the frame and the camera will hold on to that, which is a really cool feature I could see myself using quite often. The flip out monitor is small with a high quality display if it's a little flimsy feeling. And I do enjoy the touchscreen features and UI added to the C70 that are absent from the other offerings from Canon. I'm not the biggest fan of the fixed nature of the monitor, preferring the detachable style of the C500 Mark II and the C300 Mark III, but having used the C100 Mark II extensively, I was able to get used to it pretty quickly. I also didn't have too hard of a time using it outside during the day, although I'd still recommend a monitor hood or a shade of some kind just to be safe, because direct sunlight would pretty much overpower it. I was shooting my brief tests towards golden hour, so I was fine. As I mentioned, I consider built-in NDs a requirement for any video camera, and one thing I did notice about the C70 was that it swapped between the ND strengths, there's 10 stops in total in 2-stop increments, lightning quick. My C500 is rather sluggish in that realm, and I really appreciated how quickly I could flip between the NDs on the C70. It doesn't really matter, but why wait when you don't have to? You could possibly get away with chopping out a couple frames that the edge of the ND is in the shot if you were filming, as you move them, whereas on the C500 to the 300, it's like me, and that's like a half a second. That's not gonna work. In regard to picture profiles, I noticed there's a new feature in the CP menu where you can add and conform a LUT to your footage. So let's say you've got a show LUT and you actually want it saved with that look. You can toggle that on. Oddly enough, though, and unlike the C500 or 300, it doesn't seem to allow you to adjust, to just monitor with that LUT. You have to bake the look in. So in that regard, there's no custom monitoring LUT option, even in the regular menu, instead being given 3 options of 709, 1600% HDR assist, and 400% HDR assist. So essentially, you're either conforming a show LUT to the footage or monitoring with a standard like 709 LUT and applying your look later. Or you could use an HDMI monitor and put your LUT on that. Not the end of the world, but another little tick against the cinema camera-ness of this camera. Now, that being said, if you added all of those missing features, you'd basically have a C300 Mark III, which is double the price, so it's fine. Based on my brief test, I got 41 minutes of 4K XF AVC footage from a 128 gigabyte card, which basically lines up with their stated runtime of 156 minutes for a 512 card. When I had the camera, RAW wasn't a thing yet, so I didn't test that. And I got about 200 minutes of runtime on a BPA 30 battery, which isn't bad. One thing that the C70 shares with my C100 Mark II is a barrel connector for power, so running a DTAP to DC would be precarious in situations where it could get yanked out, such as shooting handheld or in an area with a lot of movement, but will significantly boost your uptime. In any case, if you're going to be shooting on the C70, especially now that it can shoot RAW, you'll need to make sure you're using a V90 card, something like the offerings from Angelbird or ProGrade, SanDisk, Lexar, or something like that. As I mentioned, there's a ton of customizable buttons all over the camera, as is standard with the C-series cameras from Canon, and I love that. I'm absolutely one to start heavily manipulating a piece of equipment or software, really anything, the second I get it to better serve my uses and make the product in question, quote unquote, disappear, leaving way for me to just get the work done. But that being said, I only really remapped one or two of the buttons on the C70, as most of them were already my most used features. Now, I am perplexed a bit by the decision to put a 3/8 inch thread on the bottom of the camera instead of a standard 1/4 inch one. I suppose you could just use an adapter, but it's still a weird choice considering most consumer or prosumer tripods and gimbals use 1/4 inch plates. There's also a thread on the side where the handle is, so you can easily shoot vertical content, which is a cool consideration. Another thing, I don't necessarily like the new joystick. The older models from the other C-series cameras are kind of rubbery and seem soft, whereas this one seems to be made more of a solid plastic, which is nice, but I've never had a problem selecting the correct direction on the old joysticks, whereas this one will sometimes select as if you've pushed it in, or, you know, go up instead of left or right or whatever, which is a little annoying, but they do give you the thumb wheel and the touchscreen, which are kind of faster to navigate with anyway, so it's not the end of the world. I also overall am not a fan of the DSLR style body, although I've been told by a few friends that they actually like that, so it must just be a me thing. I'd much prefer a rotating handle a la the C100. Actually, if the C70 was just in the C100 body, I'd be thrilled. As it stands, the body style makes it kind of hard to rig out without a cage, and even then it's almost too flat. But having seen, for instance, Chris Ray's setup, putting a cinema camera on the back a cinema battery on the back kind of elongates it and makes it a more normal size, which in that case is a net positive because doing so doesn't make it annoyingly long. You do have to decide if the monitor is in or out, though, if you were to go that route. Maybe rotate it out, pressed up against the side of the battery with an external monitor on top is the move. Also, apropos of nothing, using a focal length reducer like a speed booster doesn't make the camera full frame. I've seen way too many people say that online. It just makes it so you can use the entire imaging circle of a full frame lens. Your sensor size obviously remains the same, so you're not getting the benefit of the extra physical resolution that a full frame sensor gives you. You also don't suddenly get a shallower depth of field. You're simply getting the field of view that the lens is intended to show. That's it. It does make it a little brighter, though. An internet acquaintance of mine, Alex Stone, has a great write-up about focal reducer myths and also has a video here on YouTube. Alex makes those battery plates that I mentioned, the V-Lock ones, with a DTAP and all that. So he's cool. Anyway, there honestly isn't a lot to dislike about the C70. Certainly some specific things that might trip up higher budget sets. But in general, and especially, like I said, for solo documentary indie shooters, this thing is an absolute beast. In that vein, and in line with my diatribe at the top, I did wonder what a daily content creator might think of this camera. So given the opportunity, I took a minute to hop on the phone with Sawyer Hartman, who is a nearly 2 million subscriber YouTuber, photographer, filmmaker who had recently taken the C70 for a test run, to hear his thoughts on it, specifically where he says he found the perfect intersection of video-capable stills cameras and cinema cameras.
YouTube gave me a 70D because I had won the YouTube Next Creator program, the Next Up program. So they gave me a 70D and a 2.8 24-70 L series. And I was like beside myself excited. So then I started into that road. And in all honesty, I won a red camera in an action film directing contest. Shortly after that, and I had won a Scarlet and then upgraded to an Epic, and that had kind of introduced me to the world of cinema cameras, which is, you know, storytelling wise, exactly what I needed. And then I kept buying every Canon camera that came out just because, I do a lot of reviews. But I was looking for something special, right? Like that perfect camera. Shortly after, I got my 1DX Mark II. And that was right when I started traveling the world shooting a film every day. I don't know if you've used that camera, if you're familiar with that camera. It's just right. For some reason, that camera is just right. The video autofocus is flawless. The photo autofocus seems to just always be there. It never has problems. It never overheats. Like, I've literally wrecked a motorcycle in Indonesia and slid on my 1DX 50 feet on the concrete and then stood up and started capturing what had happened on the camera. And I never even sent the camera in for like any service. I would use cinema cameras when I had a shot list and a script. And for all other things, which was my career in YouTube, I would use the 1DX Mark II. And then I saw that the C70 was coming out. And that was interesting to me because it was right at the crossroad I needed. It had cinema camera features, as well as being a cinema camera with a proper 35 sensor. But it had built-in NDs. It had all of the features and log and everything that I knew I had loved from all of my time on set, but in a body that was big enough that I could sneak it into Disney if I needed to. So I had reached out and I was like, hey, I'd love to try this camera. And at first I was trying to use it like an R5. And I almost struggled with it for like 2 months, trying to find its perfect place in my workflow. And then a project came up for a client that wanted, again, a short film commercial. So I decided to start shooting on that camera as if it was my cinema camera. And that's when I really fell in love with it. That's when I was like, oh, wow. I kind of had that same love for the C70 that I'd had for the 1DX Mark II. It was just kind of a crossroad where, if your needs are more specialized, there might be something more proper for you. But if you're like me and you need a well-rounded tool that can cover all the bases, it's almost the obvious choice now.
He then further clarified to me what he meant by shooting as if it were my cinema camera.
I took off my zoom lenses. I went straight back to my Cine Primes. I used the adapter, which made them full frame. I started using C-Log. I also started, and this is where I started making lighting modifications. On a DSLR, I oftentimes, you just shoot what's there. You might pick the right angle, but you shoot what's there. And with the C70, I started making a little modification, putting a bounce here or adding a rim light there and shooting in the C-Log and using the preview so I could actually see what my grade would look like after. Stuff like that made it infinitely not only easier, but just more efficient. By far, the biggest game changer for me is the built-in ND filters, because I'm shooting on Cine Primes with a speed booster in the middle of Hawaii daytime sunlight on glide cams. The last thing I ever want to do is be messing with a matte box and filters and different weights. This has literally changed my life, where I can walk around. I love a good 35 mil or a 50 mil prime. So I can go somewhere with a friend and I can literally just take the one camera with the 50 mil on it, and I can go from shooting f12 all the way down to f1, and I never have to modify the camera. That's huge for me. Another thing that was a game changer for me is my ability to run third-party professional level microphones straight into camera, because that, time is money. And unfortunately on YouTube, especially with what I specialize in, oftentimes time is a commodity you don't have enough of. So there's always a risk for me when I'm shooting that something will happen with my external recorder. And since I don't have a dedicated audio guy there to monitor it, when I get home and edit, sometimes all my professional audio is just not there. And I'm left with onboard camera audio across the room with fans on, you know. Now I can take my Sennheiser microphones, I can run them straight into camera. And that to me, you know, that's kind of what I keep pointing at and tiptoeing around is this is the perfect digital creator's camera. Like if you're a YouTuber like me and you're not just taking photos everywhere, but you're actually trying to have a go at making real professional video content, it's like this is the one-stop shop. This is the one where you don't need Pelican cases of gear to make it real. You can just pop this thing out, go to work. The battery life's nuts as well. As you can tell, I'm just a huge fan. I think I've been let down by so many cameras in the past. I had built up my idea of what it could be, and then it completely bypassed. It passed that like 2-3 times.
I then asked him what his Epic isn't giving him as a solo creator that the C70 is.
Everyone's like, well, why don't you use that? It's beautiful. A ton of reasons. First one being audio has to be separate. In-camera audio is just not even a possibility on Red. I fully believe from my experience of making content online, a lot of people leave the room during the video and they're still listening. So we actually gain more information through audio rather than video. So I needed audio first. Another huge component is the Red camera doesn't have autofocus. So even if I set my own focus, I really enjoy a shallow depth of field. So even if I set my own focus, a lot of times during 40 minutes of filming, I'll readjust or lean forward or something. And there's nothing worse than getting in the editing bay and realizing your entire brand deal's out of focus. So what I realized is, in all honesty, it's not just the finished product that's important to be in focus, but as a solo creator, I have a ton of jobs. I have to be my own audio guy. I have to be my own camera guy. I have to be my own, you know, tech guy, whatever. But the hardest part is to let all that go and then actually be able to be the personality in it as well. And there's a confidence that comes. It's a confidence that was given to me by the 1DX Mark II. You know, that thing, you could be in the middle of a hailstorm running backwards in the dark and you'll be in focus. And then, you know, so many other cameras, they hunt for focus or they have a delay, or even for me, the biggest thing is, you know how a lot of cameras, they jump to focus or they just rush to focus, but the 1DX Mark II like almost unfolded where it looked like if you blew past your focus point and it came back, it almost looked like an artistic rack. The C70 did that too. And that made me so confident as a creator that I could set up my framing, quick record, step in front of the camera, and be very confident that both what I'm saying will be heard and professionally recorded, and I'll be in focus, and the camera's not going to randomly stop recording because of an error. Like those three things from a technical standpoint, they're something that most creators don't know, and it's the reason that creating is hard for them.
Noting that speed seemed to be the name of the game in his work, I asked about his process of grading C-Log 2 footage as opposed to simply shooting 709.
In all honesty, I've done tests. If I shoot just in like a Canon Vivid profile, or I shoot log and then just in Premiere throw on a 709, I've found that it's a very comparable image. It's a little less saturated and it has a lot more dynamic range. So I actually don't really like sharp, saturated, contrasty video. So I just shoot in log, but I have the preview on because exposing in log can be very difficult for beginners, which, you know, I even struggled with my first week with the camera. But then when I realized there's previews, it just it changed the game. So for me, it's not even really part of my workflow. Just I edit my project, and then the last step is I just copy paste the attributes of, Rec 709 factory and just let it convert. Obviously, short films are going to be very different, but for the sake of YouTube videos, that's definitely a great approach.
I then asked what he'd want to see in a theoretical C70 Mark II. I mentioned SDI at the time, but I'd add a locking power connector in too, but this is what he said.
When I'm working on a project, especially if I can only bring one primary camera, I need it to be able to expand to the entire, like everything in the script, right? Even if it's only a 3-second burst record, I would love some sort of 300 frames a second. Even if it's just like a 1-second end trigger. A lot of times in narrative film, especially narrative film that utilizes voiceover in the way that I do, especially for the narrative stuff, that ability to almost freeze time and allow people to see things that usually go by too fast, it's my favorite tool in my cinema, toolbox.
Now, I was kind of surprised to hear that because the C70 does 120 in 4K, which my C500 doesn't do. And that seems plenty slow to me, but Sawyer clarified.
It actually adjusts to what's going on in the world. Like what I mean by that is when everyone's cameras only did 30 frames, 60 frames was enough. When everyone's cameras did 60, 120 was enough. But now that everyone's shooting 120, in order to really like make an emphasis in the narrative for like some kind of visual, device, I think you need almost 300 now. Like if it's Scorsese and it's, right before someone gets shot in a Godfather type scene, you need that almost time frozen feel. And 120 is time slowed, not time frozen in my mind.
We then spoke a bit more about being in the moment when shooting with non-actors and how the sides of the camera or amount of equipment can become intrusive to the point of scaring off your subject, something documentary DPs have echoed multiple times on the Frame and Reference podcast, which the C70 doesn't suffer from, but that generally brought our conversation to a close. It was interesting to hear Sawyer's perspective on camera technology as it pertains to the competition, as the biggest moments for me that I can remember technology-wise were when we got 24p moved away from tape and got interchangeable lenses. Everything since then has honestly been a bonus in my mind. And honestly, I never really thought about what other folks were doing. It is interesting. When we were in film school, we were basically taught to ignore the camera itself because it was going to be too expensive to rent. It would have been film in my case, or a couple years later, the Red One. So knowing we just had to work with the cameras we had, we mainly focused on lighting, audio, and production design. We absolutely wanted to get hands-on with real cameras, but couldn't, instead just using our mini DV cams as best we could. It kind of makes sense then that amazing cameras being so affordable has made the upcoming generation, if you will, or perhaps the YouTube crowd, as I've said before, so camera-centric, as it's where the excitement is. Lighting techniques have been the same forever, more or less, but the quality of images from just upgrading a camera alone has exponentially increased every year, even since I graduated college a decade ago. I'm old. Back then, the best camera you could get at an affordable price was arguably the AF100 or the Sony FS100? Something like that. To that end, I've noticed, and Sawyer kind of touched on it with telling me that his field was becoming saturated, that the aforementioned YouTube community is becoming restless with camera technology, and I wonder if that has to do with the fact that there's not a lot of new happening. There was the race for higher resolution, that's behind us. The race for higher frame rates is largely put to bed. We've got raw recording internally in most cases, so there's that. So there's just not a lot to do now except shoot your film. So let's hope that's the next wave. With cameras like the C70 out and in people's hands, there's absolutely no excuse. And on the higher end, now that every image can be perfect, we really need to start thinking more about where that camera is being placed. What we're doing with composition, what that's saying. Start exploring more, but remembering the fundamentals. It feels like digital cinematography can lead to a lot of sameness, but also a lot of unnecessary exuberance, we could call it. The ability to move fast and shoot long with digital acquisition doesn't seem to have, in many cases, given us time to think and experiment and go dreamy with it, and instead just makes people want things faster or work without a solid vision. You know, cover the hell out of the scene and we'll figure it out later is certainly something I've heard, which isn't how you make something with intent. You know, something good that solely comes from vision. You know, these new technologies, camera or otherwise, also seem to have given some people the opportunity to overcomplicate their project, since you can now easily get, you know, super stable sweeping shots, drone shots, crazy lighting. You know, in my conversation with DP Andrew Wheeler for Frame and Reference, he mentioned a quote from Gordon Willis, ASC, where he talks about doing things simply, but not simplistically.
We're in a world now and in a business where people perceive complexity as good. It's not good. Complexity is not good. People don't understand the elegance of simplicity. There are very few people left that do understand it. I mean, the whole idea is, if you take a sophisticated idea, reduce it to the simplest possible terms so that it's accessible to everybody, and don't get simple mixed up with simplistic. That's not it. It's how you mount and present something that makes it engaging.
Can you define difference between simple and simplistic in your mind?
Well, simplistic is doing it badly. You know, I mean, you know, if you hit somebody in the face with a pie, I mean, that's simplistic. Simple is your choices. You know, it's what, you know, one light coming through a window might be quite beautiful. That's all you need. You don't need 6 other lights, because why are you doing all of this? By habit or by need? You know, it's the same thing in telling a story, or it's the same thing in making cuts within the structure of the story.
You know, I think that's a great thing to keep in mind now that we have all these fancy tools. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. We used to really struggle for added production value, but that was because we were battling against cheap-looking cameras and limited tools in post. Today, wholly different world. That production value is going to come from production design, costuming, considered lighting, and great casting, not gimbals and visual effects and hyper-real visuals, at least in my mind. And obviously there are cases where you need those things. I'm just speaking generally and musing. I'm not prescribing. But anyway, just some thoughts to leave you with. I hope this video has been informative, or at least entertaining to some degree. You know, C70 is great, you're great, film's great, technology's great. Let's just make some great things this year, shall we? Take care.